She never meant to invite trouble that night, only to save a life. Harriet Caldwell, a lone frontier widow, scraping out an existence on the rugged plains, found him half dead on her doorstep, an injured Sioux warrior whose silence spoke volumes of both pain and pride. In a land torn between fear and fragile truces, she did the unthinkable. She offered him food and shelter. As darkness closed in, Harriet's every sense warned her of danger. Yet something deeper, perhaps compassion, perhaps destiny, compelled her to act. Little did she know that by dawn's first light, the fate of two worlds would collide outside her very door. Harriet Caldwell had chosen solitude in the Dakota Territory for reasons that confounded even her closest friends back east. The year was 1875, and the frontier was wild, unpredictable, and laced with both opportunity and mortal peril. Harriet had lost her husband, Thomas Caldwell, a year before to fever. Left with little inheritance and no children, she decided to claim land under the Homestead Act, determined to stake out a new life on her own terms. Her mother, Beatrice Caldwell, had pleaded for Harriet to remain in Pennsylvania, but Harriet's mind was set. She would find independence under the vast skies of the West, even if it meant battling storms, hunger, and isolation. The neighbors, if one could call a family living 10 miles away, neighbors thought she was a curiosity. A slender woman in her late 20s living alone in a cabin she had painstakingly helped build, Harriet was known for her determination. She plowed her own fields, tinkered with the tools that broke down, and learned how to shoot well enough to scare away any predators. On rare occasions, she would hitch her old mule grit and ride down to Fort Lincoln to trade for supplies. It was there she'd once seen Colonel Henry B. Carrington passing by on a tall horse, lending an aura of official presence to the rough settlement. Harriet watched soldiers come and go, the sound of bugles floating over the dusty streets, and she felt a shiver of both apprehension and awe at how civilization and savagery coexisted on the cusp of America's expansion. Stories drifted through the settlement about increasing tensions with the Lakota Sioux, who roamed the region and viewed the white settlers' encroachment with rightful suspicion. There were rumors of looming conflicts near the Black Hills, spurred by the discovery of gold. Harriet tried not to dwell on these rumors too much. She had enough problems ensuring her meager farmland would produce enough for the coming winter. Yet she couldn't ignore the odd sense of vulnerability that came with living on land that was once the domain of a proud people, now being pushed from their ancestral grounds. Every morning Harriet would rise before the sun to feed her few chickens and check her vegetable patch. She would place a pot on the wood stove to brew black coffee, the aroma mingling with crisp morning air. Sometimes she paused on the small porch of her cabin to watch the sunrise paint the horizon pink and gold. Those moments of quiet were precious. They reminded her of the beauty that existed alongside hardship and heartbreak. She had no illusions about her place here. She wasn't a grand pioneer with a troop of strong men to protect her. She was simply Harriet, forging ahead in a world where fortitude was her only shield. And though she yearned for companionship, she had no inkling that her nearest companion would soon be one whose name her neighbors spoke in hushed, fearful tones, a Sioux warrior from a tribe many settlers deemed the enemy. Late autumn winds lashed the plains, singing a haunting melody as Harriet raked the dried leaves away from her doorway. The days were getting shorter, and each night brought a sharper chill that warned of impending snow. She had spent the afternoon gathering the last of her meager harvest potatoes, turnips, and a few stunted carrots that managed to thrive in the harsh soil. Exhausted, she was about to settle in for the evening when a strange sound caught her attention. a ragged, wheezing groan drifting through the cracks in the night. Harriet froze, her heart pounding. She turned to peer outside into the fading light, hoping it was just the wind twisting around the corners of her cabin. But then she heard it again, a low, painful moan, unlike any animal cry she recognized. Summoning courage, she grabbed her rifle and cautiously opened the door. The twilight painted the world in shades of grey and purple. She waited, breath held, scanning the yard. There, crumpled near the edge of her property line, where the tall grass began, lay a dark figure. Harriet's gut twisted. She approached slowly, boots crunching over brittle grass, her finger hovering over the rifle's trigger. Then she saw the unmistakable braids, the beaded leather, and the smear of blood staining the soil. Her mind screamed caution. This man was Lakota Sioux, the same people rumored to be growing restless with every new settler arrival. Yet Harriet couldn't abandon him. His breathing was shallow, and a nasty gash on his side was bleeding through a torn hide vest. He looked young, maybe in his early 20s, his face etched with pain and exhaustion. Cautiously, she placed a hand on his shoulder. His eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with a mixture of fear and defiance. He tried to move, but collapsed with a sharp gasp. Her first instinct was to call out for help, but who would come? The closest family was 10 miles away, and the cavalry stationed at Fort Lincoln would likely treat him as a threat. Harriet realized she stood at a crossroad between fear and compassion. Every tale she'd heard about hostilities flared in her mind, but as she stared at the wounded warrior, no threat remained, only a human being on the brink of death. She slung her rifle over her shoulder and bent down, hoisting him up with all the strength she could muster. He weighed more than she expected, nearly causing her to stumble. The man gritted his teeth either in agony or protest, but he no longer had the strength to resist. Harriet half dragged him across her yard, step by trembling step, until they reached the threshold of her small cabin. Inside, she managed to settle him on a bed of tattered blankets near the hearth. Her heart hammered, realizing the magnitude of what she was doing. She had just carried an injured Sioux warrior into her own home. She was crossing lines few settlers dared to even contemplate, and in doing so she was unwittingly setting the stage for a confrontation that would forever change her life. Harriet's hands trembled as she lit a lantern, its warm glow fighting back the gloom. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin walls. She knelt beside the wounded warrior, rummaging through her small medical kit. It was nothing special, just some strips of cloth, a jar of carbolic salve, and a small bottle of whiskey she kept for emergencies. Carefully, she peeled away his blood-soaked vest to assess the wound. A wide slash ran across his side, likely from a bullet or a blade. The edges were jagged, and infection threatened if it hadn't already taken hold. Harriet felt a wave of dread. She wasn't a trained medic, but she'd tended to her husband's final illness. She knew her way around a wound well enough to clean it and dress it. So she set about her work, pressing a clean rag against the laceration, pouring a bit of whiskey to sterilize it. The warrior hissed, eyes snapping open with fury and pain. But Harriet murmured soft assurances, though she had no idea if he understood English. When she finished cleaning the wound, she applied salve and bound it tightly with the cloth strips. The warrior's forehead beaded with sweat, and he slipped in and out of consciousness. Harriet took a step back, relieved she'd done all she could for the moment. He needed rest, warmth, and time to heal if he was lucky enough not to succumb to infection. She wondered if he had any family nearby, or if he was part of one of the bands rumored to be camped along the river. The hours dragged on. Harriet brewed a strong tea from willow bark to help reduce fever and dribbled it between his lips whenever he stirred. She whispered words of reassurance, though for whose comfort she wasn't entirely sure. Perhaps her own. Outside, the wind howled, and the moon's pale light crept through the tiny window. Harriet fought the urge to blow out the lantern to preserve her limited oil, but fear of the dark overcame her thrift. As the night deepened, Harriet found her mind wandering. She remembered the day she heard the news that Thomas was dying. She had felt powerless, terrified by the knowledge she could do little to stop the disease that ravaged him. Yet here she was, taking extraordinary measures to save a man who might be considered an enemy by her fellow settlers. She thought of her father, Seth Wheeler, who had fought in the Civil War. He used to tell her, "Sometimes our greatest enemy is the fear in our own heart." Maybe that was true. Maybe by helping this man, she was fighting not only for his life, but against the terror that threatened to rule her own. She dozed fitfully in a chair beside the hearth. Each time the warrior stirred or moaned, Harriet woke with a jolt ready to help. Somewhere deep in the night, his hand found hers, and for a moment their gazes locked. In his eyes, she saw neither hostility nor gratitude, but something more profound, a glimmer of humanity that transcended the boundaries of language or tribe. Then his eyes closed again, and Harriet wondered what the morning might bring for them both. Morning arrived in a hush, the rising sun illuminating the horizon with soft pinks and oranges. Harriet woke to find a faint glow through the cabin window and realized she must have slept longer than intended. She glanced at her patient, relieved to see that his breathing was steadier and his fever had not returned in the night. As she rose to check the bandage, a sudden prickle of alarm ran down her spine. The hairs on the back of her neck stood upright as though an unseen presence hovered outside the cabin. She moved to the window, peering through a gap in the faded curtains. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Nearly a dozen Sioux warriors astride horses formed a broad semicircle around her cabin. Their faces were painted in war colors, and each man carried a bow, lance, or rifle. Harriet's heart hammered. She instinctively backed away from the window panic threatening to overtake her. She swallowed hard, uncertain of what to do. Should she wake the injured man and hope he could mediate? Or should she attempt to speak to them herself? Harriet considered reaching for her rifle, but the thought struck her as foolish. One woman with a single firearm stood no chance against an Entauhia war party. Memories of every horror story she had heard about frontier violence flashed through her mind. Yet she also recalled the stories of dignified negotiation, of mutual respect between some settlers and tribal members. Maybe there was a chance for peaceful resolution. Tentatively, she opened her cabin door. The sight of the warriors in the full morning light made her blood run cold. One of them, a tall man with a broad angular face, dismounted and advanced. Harriet noticed that he wore a magnificent headdress of eagle feathers, and she guessed he might be a person of high standing, perhaps a leader or a medicine man. She stepped outside, leaving her rifle behind in a show of trust. Her heart pounded so loudly in her ears she was sure they could hear it. The tall man spoke in Sioux, his voice low and measured. Harriet understood none of his words, but she felt his intensity. He gestured towards the cabin and then to the other warriors, as if demanding an explanation. Carefully, Harriet raised her hands, palms out, hoping to convey she meant no harm. Just then, the injured warrior appeared at the cabin doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. He winced as he took a few steps outside. A murmur rippled through the assembled warriors, some of them calling out in relief or concern. The tall man hurried to the wounded man's side, speaking rapidly. Harriet realized they must know each other. Perhaps they were kin. The warrior's eyes flicked towards Harriet, and he managed a few words in his own language. Harriet had no idea what he said, but the reaction was immediate. The circle of warriors relaxed marginally, some lowering their weapons. Whatever was communicated seemed to indicate Harriet's role in saving him. Yet tension still crackled in the air. Harriet remained on guard, unsure whether she was about to be thanked or taken captive. Finally, the tall man stepped forward again, touching his chest. In halting English, he said, "I am 2 moons." Then he pointed to the injured warrior. "He is White Crow, my son." He studied Harriet's face, the lines of worry etched in her brow. "You saved him?" Harriet nodded, her throat tight. "Yes," she managed in a quavering voice. The entire tribe, 2 worlds, now stood on the threshold of her tiny cabin, and Harriet had no idea whether she was at the start of a fragile alliance or moments away from calamity. The tension that gripped Harriet's yard slowly began to ease as 2 moons beckoned the other warriors to lower their weapons. White Crow, still unsteady, nodded in Harriet's direction and muttered a few more words in Lakota. She guessed he was explaining how she had tended to him through the night. The faint ghost of a smile crossed 2 Moon's face relief, perhaps that his son was alive, balanced by curiosity and maybe wariness about the woman who had saved him. Harriet stepped back, allowing them room to talk among themselves. She felt her breath returning, but a knot still twisted in her stomach. The entire scenario was surreal, a solitary homesteader playing host to a group of Sioux warriors who by many accounts had every reason to hate the sight of her. She glanced around, hoping no neighboring settlers would choose that moment to drop by. The mere sight of these armed men would spark panic or worse, violence. Finally, 2 Moons approached Harriet. He gestured to the cabin, and she understood he wanted to see where his son had been treated. She led him inside, ignoring the swirl of confusion in her mind. The fireplace still glowed with dying embers, and the makeshift bed remained strewn with bloody rags. 2 Moons crouched beside it, touching the blankets as though seeking to absorb the truth of the situation. A pang of vulnerability tugged at Harriet's heart. Her humble home, her private sanctuary, was now a stage for something far larger than she ever anticipated. Through halting English nods and a few gestures, Harriet managed to convey how she found White Crow near death, how she stitched and dressed his wound, and how she had stayed awake to keep his fever down. 2 Moons, solemnly attentive, listened, and then placed a hand over his heart in a sign of gratitude. Harriet felt a slight rush of relief. Maybe they didn't see her as an enemy after all. Outside, the rest of the warriors inspected Harriet's property, ensuring no other threats lurked about. Her few chickens fluttered nervously inside a coop, and her meager fields bore the marks of an early frost. Her old mule Grit stomped restlessly in the small barn, likely sensing the tension. Each Sioux man seemed poised for conflict, glancing now and then at the horizon. Eventually, 2 Moons and White Crow returned to the yard where Harriet stood uncertainly. 2 Moons spoke quietly to White Crow, and then the younger man turned to Harriet, wincing a bit at the effort. "Thank you," he said in a soft, accented voice. It stunned Harriet to realize he spoke some English enough, at least for this simple phrase. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. White Crow then placed his hand on his chest, repeating his name. Harriet did the same, saying her name, Harriet Caldwell. An awkward, profound moment of connection passed between them. Yet even in that moment of hope, Harriet couldn't escape the realization that she was now caught between two worlds. If the cavalry or local settlers learned she had taken a Sioux warrior into her home and allowed an entire war party to gather on her land, she could be labeled a traitor or worse. And what would become of White Crow and Two Moons if a patrol happened by? The delicate ceasefire they stood upon could shatter with a single shot. Harriet forced a smile, hoping to mask her roiling fears, and inwardly prayed that this fragile understanding would hold. She didn't know it yet, but the true trials were just beginning. Within hours, word spread that Sioux warriors had been seen on Harriet's land. A single rider from the nearest settlement happened upon the scene while delivering supplies for a neighboring ranch. He kept his distance, terrified at the sight of so many armed natives, and galloped away without even speaking to Harriet. She only caught a glimpse of his startled face before he disappeared over the hill. That evening, Two Moons and the other warriors made camp a short distance from Harriet's cabin. White Crow, still too weak to travel far, remained within Harriet's humble abode. Harriet did her best to care for him, boiling water for soups, administering the last of her carbolic salve. Occasionally, Two Moons would enter to check on his son, exchanging few words in English, but plenty of unspoken gratitude. Harriet understood that White Crow's life was precious to them, and that her role in saving him had earned her a measure of protection from the tribe. Despite this tenuous safety, Harriet couldn't quiet her own anxiety. That night, by the light of a flickering lantern, she wrote a letter to her cousin Anne Ferguson in Philadelphia. She poured out the details of the astonishing events, from finding White Crow near death to being surrounded by his kin. She confessed her fear of what might happen next, whether local settlers might form a posse, or if the cavalry might storm her land to protect her, and in doing so, ignite a battle. She had just sealed the letter when the distant glow of torches caught her eye through the window. Immediately, Harriet's stomach lurched. Outside, she saw a small group of horsemen approaching from the direction of the settlement. Their lanterns bobbed in the darkness, casting menacing silhouettes across the prairie. Harriet recognized one of them, Matthew Allen, a man who ran the trading post near Fort Lincoln. He'd always been cordial to Harriet, if a bit brusque. But now his face was set in grim determination as he guided his horse forward. Behind him rode several other settlers, armed with rifles and shotguns. They reined in near Harriet's cabin, their horses stamping nervously at the scent of the Sioux camp. Harriet hastily stepped outside, hands raised in a calming gesture. She could feel the tension radiating from both sides, the Sioux warriors fanning out behind her in silent vigilance. Harriet Matthew called, voice taut. "We heard talk of trouble here. Sioux warriors on your land. Are you hurt?" Harriet shook her head. "I'm fine. They're peaceful, just tending to one of their own who was injured. I helped him." A burly man on Matthew's right spat in disgust. "You helped an Injun? Have you lost your mind?" Harriet's cheeks burned. "He was dying. I couldn't just let him perish." Matthew looked uneasy, glancing past Harriet at the gathering Sioux. Two Moons stepped forward, not aggressive, but clearly ready to defend his people. Firelight danced on his strong features, revealing no fear. The settlers clutched their weapons tighter, muttering curses under their breath. "The cavalry's been alerted," Matthew warned. "They might not be so understanding. We came to see if you needed rescuing." "I don't need rescuing." "Harriet," insisted, her voice sharper than she intended. "They mean no harm." The silence that followed was as taut as a drawn bow. In that fragile moment, Harriet could feel the entire weight of frontier tensions pressing upon her shoulders. She prayed that cooler heads might prevail, because one spark was all it would take to turn this standoff into a bloodbath. Matthew Allen and the settlers eventually backed down, though not without reluctance. They withdrew a short distance from Harriet's cabin, some cursing under their breath about foolish women and traitors. Harriet bit back her anger, willing herself to remain calm. She understood their fear tales of violence on both sides had hardened these people. Yet she also felt a quiet resolve. If they chose to fight, the entire prairie could erupt in bloodshed. After the settlers retreated, Harriet found 2 moons by the small fire outside. He was gazing at the stars, an ancient map of the skies that Harriet barely understood. She approached cautiously, hugging her shawl around her shoulders to ward off the night chill. He heard her footsteps and turned, nodding in acknowledgement. He gestured for her to sit on a log near the fire. Gathering her courage, Harriet eased herself down. 2 moons spoke in Lakota to a younger warrior, who then disappeared into a nearby teepee and returned with a pouch of dried herbs. Harriet recognized the pungent smell. It was something akin to the sweet grass she had seen Sioux other natives burn in ceremonies. 2 moons tossed a small handful into the flames, and a fragrant smoke rose into the cold air. "You help White Crow." 2 moons, said at length, his English halting but clear enough. He was near death. Harriet nodded. "Yes. I saw him bleeding. I tried to stop it." 2 moons paused, searching for the right words. "Long time our people fight. Many stories of bad things. Hard to trust. But you show kindness." He placed his hand on Harriet's shoulder, a sign of respect. She felt her heart clench with emotion. "I've heard stories too," she admitted. "But I can't turn away from someone who's hurt. It's not who I am." 2 moons gave a small, solemn nod. "You have strong spirit," he replied quietly. That night, Harriet slept with half an ear open for trouble. The settlers' sudden arrival had rattled her more than she cared to admit. She knew the cavalry might not be far behind, and if they showed up in force, the situation could spiral out of control. Her best hope was that 2 moons would move his band before the soldiers came. But would White Crow survive the journey? By dawn, Harriet discovered that word of the standoff had traveled faster than she imagined. A messenger from Fort Lincoln appeared on horseback, ordering Harriet to either leave her cabin until the Sioux had gone, or risk being deemed an ally to them. Harriet's blood ran cold. She told the messenger she was in no danger and sent him away. But his warning hung over her. If the cavalry deemed her in league with the Sioux, what might they do? As she fed her chickens, Harriet spotted White Crow stepping gingerly from the cabin, bandaged side still tender. He moved stiffly, but insisted on walking a few paces in the morning light. She watched the determination etched into his features, the way he inhaled the crisp air, as though grateful to be alive. Her mind wrestled with a dizzying thought. Was there a way to protect him and his people from the wrath of both the cavalry and the enraged settlers? And if she stood with the Sioux, who would stand with her? For the first time, Harriet felt the crushing burden of bridging 2 worlds that seemed hell-bent on tearing each other apart. Though tension smoldered around Harriet's homestead, a strange sense of camaraderie also began to grow. In the quiet moments when the sun rose high and the wind carried only the soft rustle of prairie grass, Harriet found herself learning more about White Crow and his people. One afternoon, while Harriet was tending her small vegetable patch, White Crow approached with careful steps. He pointed to a row of turnips, speaking in halting English. "Good. Food." Harriet nodded, offering him one. He studied it, sniffed experimentally, then bit into it. A tentative grin curved his lips, a gesture so disarming that Harriet felt a flash of warmth in her chest. The man who had once lain at death's door was slowly regaining his strength. Over time, bits of conversation revealed pieces of White Crow's story. His mother died when he was young, leaving him to be raised by 2 Moons and the larger tribe. He'd earned a reputation as a skilled hunter, a man who could track and trap in nearly any terrain. But he'd been caught in a skirmish with trappers who trespassed near the tribe's winter camp, and that was how he received his near-fatal wound. Harriet listened with a heavy heart, recalling her own losses. She remembered how the Civil War had left her father, Seth Wheeler, with a limp and haunting nightmares. She recalled her husband Thomas's final breaths, how she'd felt powerless in the face of inevitable death. A subtle kinship formed between her and White Crow. Both bore scars of a world rife with conflict, and both were learning that compassion could spring from unexpected places. But the outside world refused to remain silent. Riders occasionally passed at a distance, no doubt spying on the Sioux camp. Harsh rumors circulated through the settlement. Harriet Caldwell was consorting with savages, they said. Some whispered that she had been taken hostage. Others claimed she had turned traitor. Harriet received no visitors, save for the wind and the flicker of candlelight that cast dancing shadows on her walls at night. One crisp evening, Harriet and 2 Moons shared a brief but profound conversation around the crackling fire. In his own way, he told Harriet of the tribe's hardships. Buffalo herds dwindling, treaties broken. He mentioned hearing of Colonel George Custer's men scouting the Black Hills in search of gold, further fueling tensions. Harriet winced at the mention of Custer, knowing the man's growing reputation for aggression against the tribes. "I worry for the future," Harriet admitted softly, unsure if 2 Moons caught every word. "All this fighting. Where does it end?" 2 Moons closed his eyes, inhaling the chilly air. "Many of my people ask same question. We fight to keep our way of life. The land is part of us. Hard to share with those who bring fear." A lump formed in Harriet's throat. She thought about her precarious position, a settler who yearned for peace, a caretaker for a Sioux warrior, a woman labeled by some as a traitor. She wondered if her father had been right when he said that sometimes the enemy was the fear in one's own heart. In these lonely twilight hours, Harriet suspected that old fear would be tested anew and soon. The day the cavalry rode onto her property, Harriet was hauling water from her well. She heard the thunder of hooves long before she saw the dust rising on the horizon. Her pulse quickened in alarm. She hurried to warn 2 Moons, but the Sioux leader had already spotted the riders. He and his warriors formed a protective circle around their camp, while White Crow stood close to Harriet, wincing with every step. At the head of the cavalry squadron rode a stern-faced officer with a neatly trimmed mustache and dark, piercing eyes. Harriet's stomach knotted. She recognized him as Captain Robert Connolly, a man renowned for his uncompromising stance against hostiles, as he called the Sioux. Behind him stretched nearly 30 men, rifles at the ready. This was no mere scouting party. It was a show of force. Captain Connolly dismounted, scanning the scene with barely concealed disdain. His gaze landed on Harriet. "Mrs. Caldwell," he began. Voice clipped. "We received reports of a band of Sioux warriors encamped on your property. Are you here under duress, or have you willingly sheltered them?" Harriet swallowed hard, stepping forward. "I willingly sheltered one man who was gravely injured. His family came to care for him. They mean no harm, Captain." Connolly's jaw tightened. "That's not your call to make, ma'am. By order of the fort, we're here to secure this area and ensure the safety of settlers. The presence of armed Sioux is a violation of the peace." 2 Moons watched the exchange in silence, though Harriet could see the tension in his posture. White Crow stood at Harriet's side, one hand resting lightly on the bandage beneath his shirt. Harriet spoke again, determined not to let fear silence her. "They've done nothing but tend to their wounded. They are not here to attack anyone. You can see we're fine." Connolly's eyes narrowed at White Crow. He turned to his men. "Sergeant, disarm them. We'll escort them off this land and back to the fort for questioning." The command ignited a crackle of unrest among the Sioux warriors, who immediately stiffened. Harriet's heart pounded. "Captain, that's a mistake. They'll see it as an act of aggression. They should have considered that before camping uninvited on homesteader property." Connolly's tone was final. He raised his hand, signaling his men to move forward. The cavalry approached, rifles pointed, orders barked. In an instant, the fragile calm shattered. Several Sioux warriors drew back with defensive gestures, bows raised, tomahawks visible. Shouts erupted, horses whinnied, and Harriet flung herself in front of Captain Connolly, arms spread wide. "No. Please, if you come at them like this, you'll start a fight." Connolly hesitated, glancing at Harriet as though she were a nuisance. 2 Moons stepped forward, arms raised in a sign of non-hostility, but his warriors stood ready to defend him. The lines were drawn, tension crackling like lightning before a storm. A single shot rang out from somewhere behind Connolly's men. The bullet kicked up dust at a Sioux warrior's feet. In a flash, the warrior loosed an arrow in retaliation. More shots followed the cavalry, scattering and shouting. Harriet gasped in horror, ducking low, her hands pressed to her ears as thunderous gunfire erupted around her cabin. She saw White Crow lunge to shield her, an arrow clutched in his hand, but the chaos was too great to fully comprehend. In mere moments, her once quiet homestead was plunged into a maelstrom of smoke, screams, and flying lead. The conflict she had desperately tried to prevent had come roaring to life, and the cost would be counted in blood. Harriet crouched behind a water trough, heart hammering as bullets whizzed overhead. The short, violent exchange seemed to last an eternity, though in reality it was only a few wild moments. When the smoke began to clear, Harriet dared to lift her gaze. She saw one cavalryman lying unmoving in the dust. A Sioux warrior clutched his shoulder blood, staining his buckskin sleeve. The rest of both groups had taken cover wherever they could, behind boulders, trees, or the corners of Harriet's cabin. Captain Connolly barked orders for his men to cease fire and rally. 2 Moons shouted in Lakota, calling for his warriors to hold their arrows. A tense lull fell across the battleground, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of fresh blood. Harriet's ears rang, and her hands shook. Slowly, White Crow emerged from behind a stack of firewood, limping slightly, but armed with nothing more than a sheathed hunting knife. Harriet could see the strain on his face. He was pushing himself to keep standing. Their eyes met, and she felt a jolt of relief that he was still alive. Across the yard, Connolly stared back at them with murderous resolve. "Disarm them now," he ordered again. The cavalry regrouped, rifles leveled at the Sioux. Harriet stood up, holding her arms out. "Stop this! Please, no more bloodshed!" She found herself caught between the two forces, figuratively and literally. On one side, the cavalry represented the government's power. On the other side, the Sioux fought for their very survival. And in the middle was Harriet, her loyalty torn by empathy and a deep moral conviction that no one else should die on her land. Time seemed to stretch as two moons stepped forward again, meeting Harriet's gaze. He pointed to White Crow, then to Harriet, and said something in Lakota that she couldn't understand, but sensed held deep significance. Harriet took a breath. This was her moment to speak, to diffuse the situation if she could. She turned to Captain Connolly, raising her voice so the echo carried. "Captain, these people only want to leave without being harmed. Let them go. I will vouch for them. They came because I saved a man's life." Connolly sneered. "You have no authority to negotiate, Mrs. Caldwell. Stand aside. The army will handle this." No, Harriet said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I own this land. I have the right to decide who is trespassing. I invited them here when I saved his life, and I'm asking you to leave them be." For a moment it looked like Connolly might strike her. His face reddened with fury. One of his own men, older and more grizzled, touched his shoulder in caution. Around them, the cavalry and Sioux warriors watched, weapons at the ready. The slightest provocation could spark another deadly exchange. Harriet stepped closer, locking eyes with Connolly. "I swear if you kill these men on my property, I will testify against you to every newspaper and official I can find. Colonel Carrington, President Grant, anyone who will listen, because what you're about to do isn't self-defense. It's murder." A hush fell. Harriet felt her knees shaking, but she refused to back down. She realized she was risking everything, her safety, her reputation, maybe even her life. But after all she'd witnessed, after seeing White Crow's humanity, she could not remain silent. Connolly's lip curled. He flicked his gaze around, noting the uneasy stares of his own men. Finally, he signaled with his hand. "Stand down," he muttered, venom dripping from his voice. "Let them go. We'll escort them away from this land." Relief flooded Harriet like a summer rain. Two moons and the warriors began to retreat, tending to their wounded comrade. White Crow hesitated, turning to meet Harriet's eyes one last time. He placed a hand over his heart, an unspoken gesture of gratitude, then turned to follow his father. The cavalry parted in tense silence, allowing the Sioux to slip away into the vast prairie. For Harriet, it was a triumph marred by the lingering stench of gunpowder and the sight of a body lying in the dust. She knew this was not the end, but merely a respite. Tensions remained, and men like Captain Connolly would forever see her as a troublemaker. Yet she had chosen her loyalty to humanity, to compassion, and on the harsh frontier, such choices came with a price. In the days following the standoff, Harriet's homestead became a place of uneasy quiet. The cavalry removed their fallen comrade, and no one returned to claim the body of the dead settler. A bullet had grazed him when the shooting started, leading to a fatal wound. Matthew Allen rode by, once dismounting to speak with Harriet. He kept his voice low and laden with concern. "You've stirred a hornet's nest, Harriet," he warned. "Some folks think you've sided with the enemy." Harriet looked away, her heart heavy. "I sided with peace. That hardly makes me an enemy." He sighed, tipping his hat back. "I understand, but not everyone will. Word has it, Captain Connolly's complaining to his superiors at Fort Lincoln. He says you interfered with a military operation. He wants you prosecuted." A spark of defiance flared in Harriet's chest. "Let him try," she said. though inside, worry gnawed at her. She had little in the way of resources or allies. The local judge might side with the army, especially if they deemed Harriet's actions as aiding hostiles. Still, life on the frontier afforded little time for dwelling on uncertainty. Harriet needed to tend her fields before the snow fell, and her supplies of food and firewood were dangerously low. She dug potatoes, gathered kindling, and did her best to fortify her home for winter. Each evening she'd find herself standing on her porch at twilight, gazing out at the endless plains. A part of her wondered where White Crow and Two Moons had gone, if they had reached safer territory or if the army still pursued them. One morning, as Harriet was collecting eggs from her chicken coop, she heard a wagon rattle down the dirt path. She emerged from the coop, wiping her hands on her apron, only to see Dr. James Cunningham, a kindly older physician from the settlement, stopping by. She'd met him once during a supply run, and they'd exchanged polite pleasantries. Now he looked uncharacteristically grim. "I came to see if you're all right," he said, climbing down from the wagon. "I heard the cavalry might arrest you, and some folks are saying awful things." Harriet swallowed hard. "I'm fine. For now. Thank you for coming." They sat on Harriet's porch, sipping weak tea. Cunningham offered her some medical supplies, a gesture of goodwill. "For what it's worth," he said, "I admire what you did. Too many people are quick to kill first and ask questions later. You showed courage and compassion." She smiled sadly. "That doesn't seem to matter much out here." "It does," he insisted. "But I won't lie, Captain Connolly's influence is strong. Perhaps you should consider traveling east at least until things settle. The winter will be hard, and with the army against you." Harriet shook her head. "This is my home now. I won't be driven out by threats. I have to stand by my decisions, or else what good is my word? Where will I go if I run from what's right?" Dr. Cunningham nodded, respecting her resolve. Before he left, he pressed a small slip of paper into her hand. "If you ever need to send a message or find safe harbor, look up my friend Sarah Simmons in Bismarck. She's helped people in trouble before." Harriet thanked him, touched by his concern. His visit reminded her that not everyone in the West was ruled by fear or hatred. She had allies, quiet ones perhaps, but allies nonetheless. Days later, Harriet's anxiety spiked when a single uniformed soldier rode into her yard. She recognized the man as Private Roland Harris, a younger soldier she'd seen around Fort Lincoln. He looked nervous, as if he bore unpleasant news. Harriet tensed, expecting an arrest warrant or a formal summons. Instead, Private Harris dismounted and removed his hat, revealing a sheen of sweat on his brow. "I came off duty to warn you," he confessed. "Captain Connolly's writing a report claiming you obstructed a military operation and aided hostile Indians. He wants you brought before a military tribunal, but the fort commander, Colonel Carrington, hasn't approved it yet." Harriet felt her heart pound in her ears. "Why are you telling me this?" He glanced over his shoulder as though expecting to be followed. "Because I was there, ma'am. I saw you step in front of him and beg for peace. You stopped a full-scale massacre. Connolly's furious, but not all of us think the same way. Some are grateful fewer lives were lost." He handed her a folded document. "This is my statement of what really happened. If you need it, show it to Colonel Carrington. He's a fair man." Tears stung Harriet's eyes at the unexpected kindness. She clutched the paper to her chest. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Harris offered a timid smile and quickly mounted his horse, galloping away into the afternoon sun. Harriet watched him go, heart brimming with a mix of gratitude and trepidation. She had dreaded confrontation with the army, but at least now she had something that might bolster her defense. As the first snow flurries danced across the plains, Harriet prepared her cabin for the brutal winter ahead. Yet she couldn't shake the persistent sense of waiting, of expecting the other shoe to drop. Every shadow on the horizon made her wonder if a cavalry detachment was coming. Every echo of distant thunder made her heart skip a beat. In that tense atmosphere, she clung to hope and to the small acts of mercy that had punctuated the cruelty of the frontier. When winter did arrive in full force, it came with an unrelenting blizzard that howled across the plains for days. Harriet huddled inside her cabin, stoking the fire and rationing her food. She prayed that Two Moons and White Crow had found shelter, that the raging storm wouldn't claim their lives. Outside, the wind piled snow against her door, sometimes forcing her to shovel her way free just to feed her mule. On one such day, when the storm had briefly subsided, Harriet opened her door to find a small object lying in the snow, a leather pouch decorated with quills and beads. She hesitated, scanning the empty plain, but saw no footprints. Carefully, she picked it up and opened it. Inside lay a single eagle feather and a carved piece of bone etched with symbols. Harriet recognized one of the symbols. It was similar to the marking she had seen on White Crow's vest. A surge of emotion overcame her. This was a sign, a message from her Sioux friends. But how had it arrived in the midst of a blizzard? Tears burned in her eyes. She pressed the pouch to her chest, feeling both gratitude and a pang of sorrow. She whispered into the cold wind, "Thank you." Whether it was from White Crow or Two Moons, the pouch symbolized a bond that transcended the violence and mistrust swirling around them. Winter lingered, its icy grasp relentless, but Harriet persevered. She thought often of Private Harris's statement and wondered when or if she would need to use it. No riders appeared with an arrest warrant. Connolly, perhaps stymied by Colonel Carrington's caution, had not materialized to exact revenge. For now, Harriet remained free, tending her land and surviving the darkest nights. By the time the snow began to melt, Harriet emerged from her cabin to find the world renewed by spring. She shook off the chill that had seeped into her bones and set about planting seeds for the coming season. Hope sprouted beside the lingering memories of gunfire. In mid-spring, Dr. Cunningham returned, this time in a small carriage bearing fresh seeds and supplies donated by sympathetic townsfolk. He relayed that Captain Connolly had been reassigned further east, and Colonel Carrington had effectively shelved the tribunal threat. Harriet exhaled a long-held breath of relief. For the moment, peace prevailed. Over the following weeks, Harriet's homestead began to thrive again. She mended fences, replanted her garden, and even acquired a new milk goat from a neighboring rancher who'd heard of her troubles and offered a friendly gesture. Harriet accepted with a tentative smile, sensing a subtle shift in the community's attitude. Perhaps her stance for peace had earned her a reluctant respect, or at least a truce from those who once maligned her. Now and then Harriet would catch sight of distant riders, silhouettes on the rolling hills, and wonder if it might be White Crow's band returning to check on her. She never saw them up close, but once at dusk, she swore she spotted a single rider halting on a ridge, watching her cabin as the sunset bathed the prairie in gold. She felt no fear, only a quiet comfort at the possibility of a friend she might never fully understand, yet who shared a bond formed by an act of compassion on a fateful night. And so Harriet's life found its rhythm. She lived on planting, harvesting, writing letters to her cousin Anne back in Philadelphia, and dreaming of a day when frontier violence might ease. Though no grand treaties hung in the air, and prejudice still simmered, Harriet kept close the memory of a moment when compassion bridged an impossible gap. If the West was the crucible that tested a person's mettle, Harriet Caldwell had been tempered by fire. She emerged not unscathed, for scars remained scars of fear, heartbreak, and lives lost. But she held her head high, guided by the knowledge that even in a place as harsh as the untamed frontier, a single act of mercy could alter destinies. The story of Harriet Caldwell, the lone homesteader whose act of compassion ignited a standoff and forged an unlikely bond with a proud Sioux warrior. In the rugged landscape of the American frontier, where fear often overshadowed hope, Harriet's unwavering courage reminds us that even a single voice can stand against the tide of violence. She chose empathy and moral conviction over fear and prejudice, and her choice saved more than one life. If you found inspiration, excitement, or just a spark of wonder in Harriet's journey, please consider supporting this story. Hit that like button. Share it with friends who love a good frontier drama, and subscribe to this channel for more tales of bravery and heart. Together, let's keep the spirit of these incredible stories alive.